Good morning, I'm Roland Martin. Today on News 1 Now, as I broadcast live from 30 Rock in New York, the state of Alabama closes down 31 driver license offices in what some say is an attempt to disenfranchise thousands of black, mostly poor voters. We will talk with Congresswoman Terry Sewell about her call for the Department of Justice to step in. Attorney General Loretta Lynch clarifies her statements on tracking police brutality. We'll play that for you. Also, NAACP Image Award winner actor Wendell Pierce's Hollywood success didn't protect him from the ravages of Hurricane Katrina. He is here with his new book about rebuilding after the devastating storm. Also, we were there last night here in New York as Color Change celebrated their 10th anniversary with some of their biggest crusaders. We'll talk with co-founders Van Jones, James Rucker, also Executive Director Rashad Robinson, plus Selma Director Ava DuVernay. Plus, LL Cool J talks about the season premiere of NCIS Los Angeles. It's time to bring the funk on News 1 Now, TV 1. Folks, in Alabama, lots of concern when it comes to the issue of voter ID. That state has a voter ID law that has been challenged by many folks, including many voting rights activists, saying that it targets African Americans, trying to prevent them from voting. Of course, this year is the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, and of course, the Bloody Sunday March in Selma that was all about getting folks the right to vote. But the question is this move in Alabama, is this actually about disenfranchising African Americans? In Alabama, state officials say they're doing this because of budget cuts. They are closing 46 out of 50 statewide voter registration offices, driver's license offices, where Alabama residents are able to get their voter ID. Many say this is a problem that must be dealt with.
In Alabama, there are many different acceptable forms of photo ID. IDs issued by either the federal government or some agency or department of the federal government, Indian tribe, a private or public university or college, other governmental entities.
The free voter ID card is actually issued through our boards of registrars.
Congresswoman Terry Sewell, she represents the black belt there in Alabama. She's a Democrat from the state. She joins me right now there in Washington, D.C. Congresswoman Sewell, you have called for the Department of Justice to step in. You've asked them to also halt this action by the state of Alabama. We know that the Supreme Court, when they made their decision regarding the Voting Rights Act, that pretty much some critics say wiped out the enforcement of that law. That way, states now who are under pre-clearance don't have to now get approval from the Department of Justice. What do you say to Alabama officials who say this is not about targeting black voters, that people will still be able to get a voter ID in all 67 counties in Alabama?
Well, Roland, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. I think that it's appalling that the state legislators in the state of Alabama are trying to, quote unquote, balance the budget on the backs of those who can least afford to have that cost. You know, the fact is that in my district, 8 out of the 14 counties that I represent will no longer have DMV offices. And at the same time, to have a pernicious law that requires a photo ID in order to vote just means that this is a further example of disenfranchisement of African Americans. You know, of all of the offices that are being closed, 8 out of the 10 counties with the highest percentage of African American voters will have their offices closed, those DMV offices closed. And we know that that's the most popular form of photo ID.
So, according to, again, I'm reading this piece here, Secretary of State John Merrill, he said that, first of all, a voter ID can be picked up in each of the 67 counties where people can go and get a free photo ID right now. He said, quote, those IDs are located at each of our Board of Registrars offices in the state. So if he is saying that you can still get a voter ID in 67 counties, your argument is exactly what?
Alternatives don't matter if they're not readily accessible or easily obtained. You and I both know that the Board of Registrars existed in the last election, as well as these mobile vans that came around at odd hours. It was ill publicized, and so many of my constituents complained that these very forms of access, or readily accessible, just weren't accessible at all for them. And so for me, I think it's really pernicious for us to say that you're giving these alternatives in poor, underserved communities that don't have access to broadband, and in many cases don't have home computers. So what's the point of having online registration for driver's license or renewal of driver's license? And what's the point of having these mobile vans that come around once a year if they're not accessible?
I had, first of all, there were a couple of folks who hit me up, and they also said that this is not, in their minds, not specifically targeting African Americans, that white voters in Alabama also are impacted by this.
All
the
rural
closing
voters.
Out of 46 out of 50. So with that being said, with the fact that the Supreme Court, they ruled unconstitutional several aspects of the Voting Rights Act, and that is having to get approval from the Department of Justice before making any moves, how can the DOJ intervene in this to stop this from actually happening, keeping these offices open, because many of them are going to close over the next several months?
Well, you know, I know that Section 5, the pre-clearance provision, has been, shot down by the Shelby case, but we still have Section 2, and I just think that because this is disproportionately affecting African Americans, it's true that of the 31 closures, the bulk of them are in rural communities, and when 8 out of the 10 highest percentages of African American voters have their DMV offices closed, there's no denying that it's a disproportionate effect on African American voters. And so, the fact of the matter is that more than half of my constituents are affected by this. And I think that all of my constituents, whether they live in Birmingham, Alabama, or they live in Hale County, a very small county in Alabama, deserve to have equal access to essential services such as DMV offices, especially when they're required in order to vote.
Do you buy the argument from the legislature that they simply did not have the money to keep open 46 out of 50 statewide driver's license offices, and the ones that will remain open are frankly in the largest cities in Alabama?
I have a solution for the state of Alabama's budget crisis. Expand Medicaid. Accept the federal funding of billions of dollars that could go to the state of Alabama if they expand Medicaid. There are other ways to balance a budget than on the backs of the folks who can least afford to accept the additional costs. So often in these rural communities, there's limited transportation, and public transportation is non-existent. So you're asking them to drive 45 minutes to an hour and a half outside of their own communities in order to get a driver's license, and you're requiring that driver's license, being the most popular form of photo identification, is needed in order to vote. So I really think that those arguments are really shot. And when you think about the fact that most of those that are being closed are part-time offices, what kind of savings are you really enduring? These, after all, are revenue-generating operations. You have to pay to get a driver's license in the state of Alabama, as you do across this nation. So I really think that this is pretextual. The idea that you're somehow closing these driver's licenses in order to save money is a pretext for something else. Why is it that we're closing these particular driver's license offices and not others? So I think that it doesn't pass the smell test, and I'm really asking Loretta Lynch to get involved, the Department of Justice community engagement, to come with me to my communities all across my district so that we can really find out what the direct impact will be of these closures.
Speaking of Loretta Lynch, on yesterday, she held a news conference, Congresswoman Sewell, where she dealt with this whole issue as it relates to the federal data collection. And so that was a lot of controversy that came up about that. I want to play that soundbite from her. I want to get your thoughts about that. I want to also go to our panel to get their thoughts as well. She last week was in a session with Chuck Todd where she said there was no need for the federal department to really collect that data from small police departments, saying it's very difficult on them. Well, clearly that caused some serious concern among various activists. We talked about it on yesterday's show. Here is yesterday's news conference by Attorney General Loretta Lynch.
Let me be clear, police shootings are not minutia at all. And the department's position and the administration's position has consistently been that the need to have national consistent data, both on excessive force and officer-involved shootings, is vital. This information is useful because it helps us see trends, it helps us promote accountability and transparency. The point that I was trying to make at that conference related to our overall view of how we deal with police departments as part of our practice of enforcing either consent decrees or working with them. And I was trying to make the point that we also have to focus on building community trust, which is a very individual, very local practice. Unfortunately, my comments gave the misperception that we were changing our view in some way about the importance of this data. Nothing could be further from the truth. This data is not only vital, we are actually working very closely with law enforcement to develop national consistent standards for collecting this kind of information.
Congresswoman Sewell, I want to get your reaction to that because, again, it certainly caused a small storm among activists who felt that the Attorney General was saying one thing last week. So certainly glad she clarified that yesterday.
I was glad that she offered that clarification. I think it's really important that we collect that data in order to not only just see trends, but also to really document what I think so many of us are afraid of, and that is that so often our communities are left unprotected when it comes to police incidences being recorded. So I just really think that it's important that she made that clarification.
I want to go to my panel, Ray Baker Media, Michelle Bernard, President and CEO of the Bernard Center for Women, and Dr. Chris Metzler, President and CEO of FHW Fit. Folks, glad to have you there in D.C. Your thoughts about the AG's clarification, also the voter ID driver's license issue there in Alabama?
Roland, I'll start off. I mean, I'm going to go back to Alabama and the voter registration first, just because it is so unconscionable to me that I cannot believe that in 2015 this is a discussion that we are truly having. This is just another type of poll tax. It's different than how many, marbles are in a jar and what people saw 50 years ago, but it is absolutely no different. Even if we were to give state legislators in Alabama the benefit of the doubt and assume that this is unintentional, the impact on the African American community, on rural communities, is so absolutely disproportionate to those who live in wealthier counties that you can't help but conclude that this is unconstitutional. It should not be happening. When you take away the ability to get a driver's license, which is the easiest way to vote, and then you say that you have to have a voter ID law, and then you have polls that don't work, and people who are disproportionately poor, who have to work 2- and 3-shift jobs, that have to stand in line 7 or 8 hours just to vote. What else can you call it but a poll tax? It's unconstitutional, and frankly, it is an embarrassment.
Ray, Chris?
Roland, I also think that it's a slap in the face to many Americans who've heard of the voter ID laws and initially felt that something was in the air. Initially, we were told that this was not supposed to be discriminatory against African Americans or minority voters, and yet the disproportionate impact happened to be. And here in Alabama, we're told that this is not targeting African Americans. It just so happens that the impact happens to be. Well, when we see this happening repeatedly, how can we then begin to trust the state legislature of Alabama that say that this just so happens to continue to affect particularly people of the African American community? Let us also keep in mind, historically, Lowndes County was one of the more aggressive, politically active counties in 1966, using the imagery of the Black Panther, using the language of Kwame Ture of Black Power. So for that to be one of the places that are now affected, we are not surprised.
Well, I don't know that it's a poll tax or that it's unconstitutional. I think a couple of things. For me as a political scientist, there are two aspects of this. The first of which is, let us look at what the impact is. Absolutely, you must look at what the impact is. I think just because something occurs doesn't mean that it has an impact, that it has an effect that's untoward. I don't think we can really question, we can certainly question it, but from my perspective, let us first look at what the impact is and let's look at the remedies. Secondly, as a Republican, I have to tell you, there is this second part of the political aspect of this, which is in an election season, do you really want to do something like this which further puts forth the message that Republicans are not friendly to people of color and rural voters?
Well,
So
I put on, I'm not a political scientist, but I'm going to put on the lawyer's hat. Basic civil rights law 101. When you have a law that has a disproportionately negative impact on minorities, whether it be on the basis of religion, gender, race, whatever, there's a question. It is unconstitutional on its face. We don't have to even look any further at what the impact is because we know it. It's so clear. In terms of the politics, it feels as if this is I believe Representative Alabama state legislator is predominantly Republican.
It is.
I question, as an African American, how smart this is. However, it seems to me that the Republicans in Alabama believe that this is a smart move to make because the people who like the Republican Party, at least in that state, are probably saying, hooray, let's get rid of the people who voted for Obama. Let's make sure that people who vote Democratic have an inability to do so in 2016, and then they can carry out their desires to get rid of Mexicans and everybody else that they find offensive.
Congresswoman, go ahead with the final comment there.
Well, listen, I just think that you're absolutely onto something. I think that that's why I called on the Department of Justice, which traditionally federal protections have been the way that African Americans in Alabama have been able to get some justice and some relief. And, you know, it's ironic that the Shelby case, which originated in Alabama, the reason why there were so many Alabama state legislators that were saying hurrah is that we've come so far in Alabama that we don't need federal oversight. Well, this is example evidence number one of why we still need to restore the vote. We need to restore the Voting Rights Act and make sure that federal protections are there for the most vulnerable in our communities. It's really unacceptable when across the board you choose to close DMV offices that are in predominantly African American districts that, yes, voted predominantly for Obama in both 2008 as well as 2012. And we shouldn't sit back and take it.
All right, Congresswoman Terry Sewell from Alabama. We certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Folks, coming up next, our headlines, including the latest on Hurricane Joaquin's devastation in the Carolinas, especially in South Carolina, where many of our viewers have been affected. After that, Hurricane Katrina had an impact on the life of actor and activist Wendell Pierce. We'll talk about that with his new book. Also, our cameras were here last night in New York at the Color Change Gala, where they honored their two co-founders. We will hear from Rashad Robinson, their executive director, and also Van Jones and James Rucker. Plus, Ava DuVernay was also honored, and she talks about her continuing effort to help independent filmmakers get their work on the big screen. It is 18 after the hour. News 1 now on TV1.